Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm so excited to be presenting this for you today. Please introduce yourself in the chat if you have not already. We'll be beginning in a moment. First, I want to just introduce myself. My name is Summer Dawn. I'm the founder and director of In Full Color. Very happy to be here today presenting our Blue Masterclass, Getting Grants and Residencies. In Full Color is an organization that empowers women of color and other BIPOC of marginalized genders through education and the arts. So this includes Black, Hispanic, Latinx, Asian, Middle Eastern, Arab, Indigenous women. We include queer, trans, disabled women. It's a very diverse group. We are most known for producing an annual show featuring about a dozen artists of color from around the country, sharing their stories in their own voices. So for those who don't know us, here is a picture from 2019's show. This is Rukaya Bluford performing Three Things I Learned Before Becoming a Woman, a poem about growing up and realizing some of the oppressions women face. This was the show opener, and I really wanted it to be a display of sisterhood and unity. So that's the entire cast of the show crossing behind her. And then this was 2018's opener. It was actually completely silent. Each person came out one by one and knelt or stood and held up the Black Power fist. And then we just stared at the audience for a minute. It was very powerful. For folks who are interested, our 7th season is coming up and will be virtual. You can find out some more information about it on our website, infullcolor.org, but that's going to be May 20th and 21st. And we also do markets, we do classes, we do dance, we do concerts, lots of fun stuff, all by women of color and other artists of BIPOC artists of marginalized genders. So, I see some folks introducing themselves in the chat. Very excited to meet all of you. Without further ado, here is today's presenter, Dena Igusti. I'm going to stop my share screen. Take it away, Dena.
Awesome. Thank you, Summer, and thank you, everyone. Hi, everyone. My name is Dena Igusti, pronouns they, them. I am a multimedia artist and mostly a writer, specifically working in poetry and theater, and even a little bit of screenwriting. And basically for today, I'm just going to talk a little bit about applications, grant applications, all of that jazz, writing residencies, fellowships, and kind of navigating your application materials and other things you need to consider. So let me just share my screen. So here we go. Okay, so this is going to be a general guide. For this meeting, I'm going to be relatively candid, and just to give a couple of disclaimers. One, I am not the type of person who applies for things with the notion of lying in a particular way, or not catering to organizations or institutions. That's not the way that I like to go. I am also not the type of artist that like kind of is okay with saying certain things that I don't wholeheartedly agree with. So that's just something to keep in mind as I'm talking about everything and as like I talk about application materials and tips. So yeah, and if people can put in the chat for a little bit as I'm like going in, like kind of your grant writing or application experience, just so I know what to kind of rush through and what to actually go over as it goes on. And also feel free to drop questions in the chat. And of course, there's going to be a Q&A after. But yeah. Okay, so a little bit about me. As I said before, I'm more of a multimedia artist. I specifically work in theater and poetry with a little bit of screenwriting and within the near future, comic writing. This isn't necessarily for me to brag by any means, but these are just kind of the things that I have had so far and I have received so far in regards to grants, residencies, and artist development programs and or fellowships. You could feel free to take a quick look at it. If there's anything that you want to ask me about specifically, please let me know and like feel free to ask, like, hey, how did you get into this thing? Hey, what is this program? I've heard about this. Especially for the time that we spent together, I would really, 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 really love to know what everyone's kind of in. And oh my God, like all these comments are really, really like kind. Okay, so is my space bar? It's working. Okay, there we go. So we're going to talk a little bit about the definitions between each thing. I think oftentimes when you are in the beginning of submissions, all these words are kind of popped up and it's not sure what exactly they are. So for grants are essentially a set stipend that's provided to artists, and it is meant for them to continue their career. This can mean a lot of things. It essentially is just when an organization or a program provides you money, but it can be for a number of purposes. So it can be for the development of a project, it can be merit-based, so what your work has been so far and they want to award you for it. Need-based, so you can apply for grants to help cover for medical bills, food bills, rent, etc. And we'll also touch on that a little bit as we go on. Or they can be unrestricted. So it can basically be whatever you want it to be, and you don't have to show proof. So you don't have to worry too much. And again, we'll go more into that later. A residency is when artists are provided with either a workspace, a living space, or both to reflect research or produce work for a short period of time. Usually it's about 1 week to several months. And artist development programs or fellowships are kind of similar to residencies, but more so on the workspace end. And workspace can mean kind of a plethora of things. It doesn't necessarily mean a physical, tangible space, especially in fellowships. Sometimes it can mean an office. Sometimes it can mean like having a Google Drive or like a space on the internet, or like being able to publish at the end. The idea of space is a little bit different around fellowships and development programs, but basically artist development programs and fellowships help artists with career development for an extended period of time. So rather than like a week to a couple of months, usually it's like 3 to 6 months or longer. Sometimes they'll have collaborative programming. So this might mean you are working in a cohort. It might mean you're working in groups. You might be creating something individually, but you are helping each other as in that process, or you're creating one big project together. And oftentimes you have to produce some kind of work, and that is expected either during or at the end of the program. So here's a big list, and feel free to like take pictures or screenshot, but also just to keep in mind, a PDF will be sent over later on, so don't worry too much about notes. But where to find opportunities? Alliance for Artist Communities, which is especially important for residencies. It is basically a big internet database that provides all the upcoming residencies that are available, that are present. You can include filters like if you want to live there, if you want it to be paid, if you want to be unpaid but you want a workspace, if you are willing to pay to be in that space. Things along those lines. They also have they have one specific tab, I don't remember the exact name for it because it's changed over time, that's dedicated to new residencies, where there are upcoming residencies and they're trying to look for their first groups of cohorts, and usually like you're more likely to get into those. So that is one really great option, especially for residencies. The submittable discover page. So if you have already been in the submission process, and for those who don't know what submittable is, it's basically a software where you are allowed to submit to different places. If you're in the publication realm, if you have been in poetry or writing of any kind, you're probably already familiar with it. But basically you can send in your cover letter, your bio, and application materials to this one site instead of sending constant emails. It is completely free. But there is one tab called the Discovery tab, where if you look up grants, if you look up residencies, if you look up fellowships, it'll provide the ones that are currently open for applications during a specific period of time. Tip Sheet Art is a Instagram page that I really, really like. It is a multimedia artist opportunity page, and pretty much when you follow them, they just post different artist opportunities that are available that are submitted to the page. Art Open Calls is also another Instagram page, and they also have a website as well, and they do a similar thing. Entropy Mag's Where to Submit column is basically a section of Entropy Magazine, which is a multimedia literary magazine. And their Where to Submit column basically gives all the opportunities, and it's more for the literary side, so just keep that in mind. But for any presses that are coming up, any submissions, any publications that are open, but there's also sections for residencies and fellowships. So especially if you're a writer, look into them. And the small thing, which is very, very particular, but it's also how I've ended up finding out about a lot of opportunities, is looking at newsletters that you're already subscribed to. If you already follow certain artist pages, if you've bought something from a certain arts organization, usually they post their open calls at the bottom section of their newsletters to kind of fill up the content of their newsletters, especially for Foundation of Contemporary Arts. I have found my grants through them. United Solo, I found my grants through them. And even for some brand sponsorships that I've been under, they're in their artist programs that are like a clothing company or a makeup company. They usually also have an open call for artists as well, but they're not outwardly advertised. So just keep that in mind too. So when you are looking for grants and looking for the types of grants you want to look for, there are certain factors that you need to consider. Some of the things are, how much are they going to pay you? How much is it actually going to be worth? Will it actually cover any expenses that you need? And I say this not because don't reject money. Of course, like if you want money, grab money, but also if it's a small $50 grant and they're asking you for 15 pages, how much do you really need that $50 grant? 50 as in 50. Or a micro grant when you can also spend that energy towards a slightly bigger grant, given your time and given your own bandwidth, right? Is it restricted or unrestricted? Meaning, do they care where this money is going towards? Are they asking for a budget plan? Are they asking for proof that you spent it on a specific thing? If a grant requires that it has to be towards, for instance, artist development of a project, sometimes that means that later on in the process, you have to give them proof, usually receipts or something along those lines, that you actually spent the money on those things. Or you have to give a budget plan that explains how you're going to use that money. Usually it's an Excel sheet. And for instance, if you're in the production, like theater world, for instance, usually it'll be like a light designer, rate, budget, costume design, casting, actor fee, artist fee, director fee, playwright fee, like things along those lines. So keep that in mind when you're looking for grants and whether or not that is something you have to consider, of whether or not it's restricted or unrestricted. And this is kind of similar, but what are the conditions of this grant? So especially for merit-based things, and a merit-based grant is basically a grant where you're awarded based on your previous work. Do you need to provide a portfolio? Do you need to give proof of your work? If you are, for instance, applying for a grant where you need to have something covered for production, do you need to have a production date at the time, or can this be for a work in progress and you don't really know when it'll premiere, when it'll be exhibited, et cetera, et cetera? Is the grant for your work or is it for your well-being? And either is completely valid. There's nothing wrong with either one, but it's something to consider, especially if you are in particular situations or you need the grants for whatever reason. Medical grants, I explained before, basically if you have medical bills, or if you have an outstanding medical balance and you need those to be covered, there are several organizations that will provide a grant for you, but oftentimes they will ask for proof of billing. Living grants or emergency grants, I think like this past 2020, a lot of people have seen like the COVID relief grant if you've missed income or if like you have rent due, et cetera, et cetera. Those are kind of need-based grants, and that usually you would have to like extensively explain your situation and explain why you need this money. And whether or not you need to provide proof depends on the organization, but that's something you have to consider, right? Do you feel comfortable giving a large description of your current situation? Merit-based grants, as I said before, it's for past work. So do you have a portfolio ready? Do you have an extensive proof of your work available? And we'll also get into a little bit more of what proof of work will look like. Work funding is another thing where if you, for instance, are working an unpaid internship, but you still need to get paid, there are also grants that are available in regards to that. So for residencies and fellowships, there are several things you have to factor. And while they are very different from each other, kind of what you need to consider is relatively the same. So for residencies and fellowships, one of the main things is to consider is how long do you want to stay in the program? And especially if you are a working artist or if you have a day job that is different from your art, you need to consider that, right? Like if for instance, like you only have certain time off or like certain vacation time, do you want it to only keep in that realm? If you're a full-time artist, if you have a lot of exhibitions and other programs and other things lining up for you, um, especially if it's for a residency or fellowship where you're outside of your state or your town, how long are you comfortable being out there and how long can you be out there without it compromising your work? The second thing is how many artists and fellows will be there. While on one hand, having a large cohort can help in terms of the probability of you getting in. At the same time, if you are an artist where you do need to be well supported by staff, and need to have specific attention to your needs and also to the resources that are required for your work, having a smaller cohort might be a little bit better, especially even if you prefer more intimate settings or if you are overwhelmed socially by a lot of people. Usually for residencies and fellowships, it ranges from 1 to 55 people overall during a certain period of time, but that's something to consider. Especially for residencies, this is more specific to residencies, but food, accommodations, additional stipends that are available. Depending on the residencies that you get into, especially if they are living space related, they often will provide things like bed, Wi-Fi, like housing, food, like they will provide meals for you. Depending also on the residency, which is a good hint, especially after you get accepted, find out if there's additional funds that are available. For instance, can they give you, and if they're already giving you a stipend to be there, can they give you an additional stipend to cover your rent, to cover for childcare, et cetera, et cetera. I know a lot of folks, especially those who have families, where they have been able to get additional funding. So let's say they got $2,000 for like 2 weeks of being at a residency, they were able to get an extra 500 or an extra 1,000 to cover childcare when they asked shortly after. So that's something to also consider when you're in residencies. The time of year and when do you want to be a part of these fellowships and residencies is really important too. Not only in terms of your vacation time and when you're available, but also even like the application process itself. If the residency and fellowship takes place around May to August, usually those are a lot more competitive because you're also competing with folks who are usually off on vacation, have summer vacation, are coming back from school, et cetera, et cetera. But if the residency takes place from September to April, it's usually a lot less competitive because usually there's not as many people that are applying because of work and things along those lines. The other thing is application waivers. I know I said some in this presentation, but honestly, a lot of fellowships and residencies, especially if you're in screenwriting, require an application fee. And they're usually I don't want to say they're usually hefty. It depends. It ranges from like $3 to like $95. It's a big gap. I would say in screenwriting more so, it's usually $30 is like the minimum for deadlines, and then it goes later on. Do they give an application waiver? Is this something that you can inquire about? Usually when you're in the submissions process, they'll usually say right off the bat whether they can or they cannot. But if they don't really say anything, you can email them and ask for a waiver. But just be prepared to provide a statement of need, which means that you just explain why you can't afford the application waiver or why it's not in your best interest to pay for the application waiver, and or provide tax information. I've definitely seen, especially in the playwriting side, a lot of instances where you'd have to provide some proof of income, usually your previous tax return, to prove that like you cannot afford the application waiver. And the last thing, especially because of the way artists and content creators have kind of mushed and like kind of coincided together in particular ways within the past few years. Is this really a residency or fellowship, or is this just more of an internship and it's just called a residency or a fellowship? Especially if you are a media creator of any kind, whether that's a video editor, whether you're a multimedia artist, especially if you're in the digital arts of like graphic design, print design, things along those lines. Be wary of the descriptions of these residencies and fellowships, because sometimes it'll say something like, throwing off the bat, or like to give a particular example, Rare with Google provides a fellowship where you have to work 40 hours a week for 3 months with a stipend of $3,000. It's not necessarily a residency or a fellowship in that like you get the space to create and develop your art. It's just more of an internship, which can still be helpful. It's not as if it wouldn't be helpful for you. But keep that in mind as well, as like, if it's just an extension of a 9 to 5 and that's something that you're not interested in, keep that in mind and just be careful of the language in regards to that. Okay, so some of the things that you will need before the app or before you get into the application process. The first thing is your bio. The first thing is your bio. We'll get into bio creation a little bit later, but for bios, usually for a standard one for application sakes, usually you would provide accolades and names wherever you can in your bio. Your CV or your resume. If you're an artist, you're more so on the CV side, but for those who don't know what a CV is, essentially a CV is just a description or a long, essentially a list of all the things that you've done and have featured and have been published. I will get into a little bit of that kind of, but not too much. Usually it's about 1 to 2 pages, but depending on how extensive your artist career has been, it might be way more. Just be wary of the guidelines when applying. Your portfolio or your website that is public, specifically work in press. I know for a lot of art students, especially for those who do a lot of work in progress, there are a lot of reasons why you need to have certain work to be password protected. However, a lot of the times for residencies and fellowships, and especially for grants, it is very hard for organizations and panelists to worry about a password and even having to worry about whether or not they access it. There have been times where even if they ask for a password protected thing, if it's the wrong password and depending on how many applicants they have and the pacing of when they need to do things, they might not ask you for the password and you're just going to count you as you not having a work sample, which is super frustrating. So kind of the leeway around it is like, if they ask for password protected things, go for it, send those things in, especially if that best reflects your current work at that time. But also make sure that you have a portfolio and website that is public, so that way they know that there is still a baseline that they can go off of when considering you. So make sure that that is public. Don't worry too much. I think a lot of people worry about the concept of like buying a website or buying the portfolio. You don't really need to. It doesn't necessarily matter. And also depending on what grant you get, you can just say that you kind of need to buy it. And part of the funds go to that. But that's a whole other thing. My recommendations for portfolio website stuff, I definitely recommend Cargo, especially for visual artists and digital artists, just because the interface is really nice. And also if you don't pay for it, I think the end link for it's Cargo, it's like .cargo.site, and it's not as jarring as kind of like the other end link terms and things. So I highly recommend Cargo. And then of course there's WordPress and Squarespace, usually because there's just a lot of discounts in regards to them. Make sure that you have a project ready and a description, especially if you're applying for residencies and grants. And especially if they're centering around a project. Make sure you kind of have a concise description. I would say about like 50 to 100 words that kind of explain what your project is and what it is about. And we'll get a little bit more into it for proposals. Make sure you have descriptions of the lengths and mediums of the proposed project. So if it's visual, so if it's a video, make sure it's 20 minutes long, or if it's a theater project, it's 20 minutes long. If you are doing artwork, oil on canvas, digital with Photoshop, etc. Just make sure that you kind of have those ready, because they'll ask that often, especially when you send a large work sample and they ask for every individual work sample and the mediums of each one. The summary of your proposed project, if asked for one, So this is a little bit different from the description sometimes, and this is more so for like if you're in theater or screenplay side of things, and even for like poetry if you're doing a longer work, or if you're doing, or even in writing for any of the print works. The summary proposed project is more so the plot line and what is the narrative that's surrounding it, while the description is kind of more for like visual artists in that regard. And also the summary of a recent project. And this will kind of go for any art genre, but basically just a short description or kind of the general plot line of the last project that you've done. That is something that's often asked in applications as well. So make sure you kind of have this prepared. And for grants and residencies and fellowships that usually provide a stipend, make sure that you have some form of online payment specifically ready. That could be a PayPal, making sure that you share your routing numbers so they can send a check, Venmo, etc. Usually a PayPal has been the most common one. Just make sure you kind of have that available. Just because we're proofing and things like that, it's a lot easier to get money. And especially if you are applying for grants where it is need-based and you need money quickly, just making sure you have an online form of payment on hand. So we're gonna go a little bit into parts of an application and kind of explaining a little bit of what exactly these things are and what these categories and these super long applications actually are. The first thing is the artist and the personal statement. So this is mostly about who are you? What are you about? Why do you do your discipline? Why this medium? What themes do you actually tackle? The personal statement is really where you get to shine and talk more about your work and your relation to your work with you. They already have the resume, they already have the CV, they already have the work samples. They get what you do, but why do you do it? And who are you as an artist in relation to the work you've done? The why them, also the artist and personal statement is the same as the mission and value statement. Usually the terms interchange, but it's essentially the artist and personal statement. The why them or the statement of need. They're both kind of similar, but not necessarily. But basically, why are you reaching out to this org? Why are you applying to this org and this application? How can they actually help you? Sometimes it's not a separate question in applications. Oftentimes it'll be included in another portion. So it'll be like, give us your artist statement and a reason why you want to go to this org. Then what you would do is kind of have your artist statement first and then your statement of need in like a second or third paragraph. So just keep that in mind. But usually they'll include it in another portion, whether that's a proposal, whether that's your artistic statement, etc. The proposal, which is what we're talking about with the project description, is what are you working on and why? What is the exact thing that you are, if you are specifically applying for residencies and fellowships where you have to work on something in particular, as well as any grants where you have to get funding for a project. What exactly is it? Why are you working on it? And usually that's just a description of the project, the summary of it, and the medium and the title. Your bio, it's a general overview of your work and your identities and accolades in a short 150 word or less summary. We'll get into it a little bit more in terms of like what do you need to include in a bio, but this should be just a good general summary of you that highlights the main aspects of you and your work. You don't have to put every single thing in it, but put the things that you're most proud of, and also even the things that you know like seem reputable. If there are names that are involved, add those names, all that stuff. Your CV, which we talked about earlier, but yeah, usually it's about 1 to 2 pages. Have different versions of your CV. And what I mean by that is, especially if you have a lot of work and like a very extensive portfolio, have one version where it's everything, one version that is 1 page, and then a version that's 2 pages. The reason why I say this is because those are usually the common ways in which CVs are asked. And for the 2-page max, if it doesn't fill 2 pages, don't force it into 2 pages. But if you have an instance in which like the max can be 2 pages, but you have a 3-page CV, have a version where it's 2 pages, and then have a version of your CV where it can be condensed to 1 page. If you're a multimedia artist, also similarly, have a CV where it includes every aspect of your work, but then have versions of your CV where it only highlights one medium at a time. Mainly because just depending on the grants and the fellowships, there might only just be focused on that. And when you're trying to figure out how to condense everything, it's usually just easier to know that you have different versions of your CV that focus on one medium or the other. For your work sample, it really depends on the length and type. It varies by the application and by the discipline. But overall, usually it's about 2 to 10 pages if it's writing based, or 2 to 5 images or videos if you're doing any work that involves some type of capturing an image, painting, etc., or video, whether that means you are a performance artist or some kind, or a filmmaker. Letters of recommendation. Then honestly, personally, I've never had to worry too much about letters of recommendation unless I went to like very, very, very large institutions. But you can also get a very supportive and stable artistic career where you don't necessarily rely on the contents of letters of recommendation. And I'm saying this especially for folks who, like, for instance, do not have a professor who can like recommend them. You don't really need to worry too much about it. Some may ask, some may not, but usually how they go about it is they would ask for the contact info and the relation to the person, and then they'll ask, then they will email the recommenders separately so they can submit their letters. So if you are doing it that way, always ask in advance. And in terms of folks that you're wondering, especially if you have not, like me, I did not go to school for the arts. Who can you ask? Usually ask peers or mentors or someone who knows your work. If there's a colleague who can write a recommendation letter for you and you worked on a project together, go for it. The people who usually are the folks that I ask for letters of recommendation if I need a letter of recommendation are usually just my editor from my book publisher that I'm already close friends with, one of my writing colleagues where we've collaborated on a theater project with, and then a director from one of the plays that I've written. It doesn't have to be someone who's necessarily quote unquote higher up. So just keep that in mind, and don't worry too much about like the letters of recommendation aspect. Okay, so for the artist and personal statement, which also includes the mission and value statement, they're the same thing, honestly. Like I said before, the whole point of it is who are you, why do you do your discipline, and why this medium, and what themes do you tackle. So I'm not saying the following points I'm going to say, they don't have to be in this exact order, but these are 5 things that you should make sure are included within your personal statement or mission and value statement. 1, make sure you state somewhere in the beginning of your statement the type of work you do, what themes you tackle, and identities that are important to your art. This is especially important for multidisciplinary opportunities where they are navigating a bunch of different artists from a bunch of different mediums. It doesn't have to be extensive, but the reason why I say this is because oftentimes when statements are given to panelists and when they're given to people who are judging your work, sometimes it is read quote unquote blind, in that like they have yet to see your artistic statement, they don't know your name, they don't know exactly who you are, they're just reading the statement alone. So they're just reading this whole thing where you're talking about all these other themes. If they don't know what medium you're in, it's hard for them to navigate the significance of those themes, the significance of your identities in those works. And it's also a common thing where I've looked over for folks where they have done artistic statements because in another section of the application, they wrote what their work is, like photographer or theater artist. They assume that panelists know that offhand. Just in case, just make sure that you include kind of who you are in your general job description. So for me, it's like, as a queer Indonesian poet, just having that right off the bat. 2, don't be afraid to tap into personal experiences or observations that influenced your work. It could be a song lyric, an observation of your community and generational patterns and memory, etc. I know, like, for instance, very world-renowned poet Safia Hillo, like, for her personal statement for Poetry Foundation Fellowship, like, she quoted Old Dirty Bastard right off the bat, you know? For me, in my personal statements, I tend to talk about like missing narratives because of the fact that like Indonesian Muslim diaspora has a lot of emphasis on assimilation in New York City, you know? Just things along those lines. Don't be afraid to get personal. You don't have to tell a whole life story, but at the same time, don't be afraid to go into exactly what influenced you to do the art that you do. Um, and don't think that it's like silly or ridiculous or like don't worry about that, honestly. um 3, and this is super important, explain why you do the work with the medium that you are in. Get into the specifics on what your medium serves for you as an artist. For instance, we can talk a lot about the contours of the body and the complexities of the body in so many different genres. So why are you doing it with poetry? Why couldn't you do it with, for instance, dance or choreography or playwriting or improv or performance art? Why specifically poetry or writing? Do you have to explore the complexities of the body? So similar with other themes, just keep that in mind and explain why the medium that you use is important to you. For me, for instance, I like using poetry versus like journalism because I feel like poetry pushes on the truth way more. Statistics often have bias, and when you present certain statistics and when you don't present certain, and when you don't present others, it creates a certain bias. And I think poetry, with the honesty of my perspective, gives way more truth over who I am than trying to research a bunch of numbers that will back me up. And that's something that I would probably say, right? In an artistic statement. 4, if you mention your identities, touch on how your identities impact your writing. And I say this in the sense of you don't have to do it in this way that caters to institutions or artists. I'm not necessarily personally not fully for it. But if that influences your writing and you mention it in the beginning, how does it impact it? You don't have to say a full exact thing, or it doesn't have to be a separate sentence, but that's something that should be included somewhere in your statement. Like if I mention in the beginning that I'm a queer Indonesian poet, what about me being queer and what about me being Indonesian influences my poetry and my writing? Um, and then 5, finish off with a strong closing sentence that ties it all together. It doesn't have to be, when I say a strong closing sentence, I don't necessarily mean it has to be this like wistful thing. Um, but it should be something that kind of ties in everything that you say, especially if you are working in different things and in different genres and you're touching on so many other points in your personal statement. Just make sure you have something that kind of closes it all. Okay, so this is a long, long example. And again, you all are going to be given this example later on, but this is the example of a personal statement that I gave for the Broadway for Racial Justice casting directive field. So you see right from the rip, I'm mentioning the Muslim Indonesian non-binary aspect of my life, mentioning why I got interested in casting, and mentioning the fact that a lot of performance opportunities weren't connected to me because a lot of the roles are very stereotypical, and not being comfortable with that. Going a little bit into the history of my own writing and my own theater experience and how that sparked my interest in casting. Because I was able to do a lot of extensive research that was outside of the usual Western American gaze. And then towards the end, even though this is about casting, I'm mainly a writer. So I'm going to mention a little bit about me being a writer. So as a writer, I understand the importance of bringing your stories to life. Oftentimes, it is not simple as having someone who simply fits the physical requirements of your characters. And then towards the end, I kind of just finished it off where I went into all these extensive like things in regards to writing and casting and archetyping and stereotyping that's present within media industries. And like, that's why I want to get into casting. But explaining what else do I want to get into in regards to it. So summing it up by saying that I want to emphasize the importance of understanding historical and colonial contexts in different cultures when considering casting, and getting into the field altogether. So yeah, I just want to quickly check the chat real quick if there's anything else. Okay. Thank you, Summer. Yeah. Just to answer some earlier questions, is there a database you've subscribed to? You do not have to subscribe to it. It's just more so if you follow all the ones that I mentioned, there isn't anything that you have to subscribe to for the database in terms of the Artists Alliance communities. There isn't a thing they have to subscribe to, but if you want to know the opportunities in real time, follow their Instagram page. And usually the database, they kind of just show up, but there's no actual subscription or fee. But yeah. So the why them / the statement of need. I hate this part of the application the most. It is so frustrating. It's so weird to be like, well, why do you want to work with us? What will your work be brought out through us? For me, it gets very, very, very uncomfortable because, like I said earlier, I think like it feels weird pandering in particular ways. So here's kind of what I do where it doesn't feel like this whole like ego stroking thing. And it's not because like I don't want to necessarily quote unquote ego stroke, but it's like I don't want to, my fear is always, am I lying or gassing up something that like they don't actually do? So this is kind of how I get around to the why them and the statement of need. Same thing as before, they don't have to be in this particular order, but these are things to consider and to include in your why them section / the statement of need. The first thing is understanding the organization's values and see which aspects match up with yours and highlight those values. Usually, whenever I see the why them, immediately I go to the website, I look at their about section, and then go straight to their mission and values and see what actually does genuinely fit. Not in terms of like, okay, what can I talk up the most? But for instance, if one of their things is commitment to accessibility for artists, bringing up that aspect and bringing up how it matches with mine because of the fact that like I have limited resources. I come from an artistic background that isn't traditional in the sense of I was not academically or formally trained in the work that I do now. Highlighting kind of those aspects, I think, and we'll show a little bit in sec, but that's kind of one of the main things is making sure that like there are actual tangible mission values and you don't have to necessarily re-quote it in a particular way or use it verbatim. But you can kind of mention it casually where you can say something along the lines of, you know, as an artist who is committed to sharing resources with other artists and something along those lines that sounds kind of similar to their wording in their about section. You can go for that too. Number 2, go into not only how, and this is especially for the statement of need section of things when you're applying for need-based grants and medical grants. Go into how, don't only go into how their physical amenities will help you, but also how their mission and culture as an organization and the communities that they foster will help you as well. So for instance, XYZ's emphasis on creating tangible impact through art will help me transform my writing beyond virtue signaling and raising awareness. Yeah, that's like an example. If an organization cares about like creating physical impact, then focus on the fact that like you want to improve on that in your own art and your own writing. 3, if it's a need-based grant or residency, so to explain a little bit, I didn't get to earlier, but what a need-based residency is basically a residency where you show that you do not have the space to work on your art and they will provide you with a free space for it. Or if you need a space last minute because you are working on a project and your current situation does not allow you to work on said project, you will be provided with something. So for a need-based grant or residency, explain your current situation in detail. It doesn't have to be in full detail, but be extensive. And what is lacking in the current artist practice that they can actually provide. And when I say explain in detail and explain it, I don't, again, mean go into your whole life story, but I do mean give numbers. If you know, for instance, like how much income you've lost, how many people you live with, add that. Be very specific about it. When you're very specific about the descriptions, you can get a better idea of how much you need it and why. So for instance, saying I live in an apartment shared by 9 people and they have very thin walls. Having a private studio will allow me to create my self-tapes without disruption and without disturbing others. Or I lost $6,000 in income due to, let's say, COVID-19. And this grant will help supplement for my rent, utilities, et cetera, et cetera. So that is something to like emphasize, is like be specific on the details and having physical descriptors of what's going on in your situation, and having numbers available. Okay, so here's an example from one of my applications when I worked for Ars Nova. When I started under Ars Nova as an Emerging Leaders Fellowship. To give context on what this fellowship was, it was basically a fellowship that kind of allowed you to foster the administrative side of the arts, so like grant writing, marketing, etc. And for me, I was in a space where I would do art on one side of my life, and then I would do marketing on another side of my life. And they were always separate entities, and I never had to work on both at the same time. So this why then example kind of explains that in a particular way, where I'm saying like how it will not only leverage my current marketing skills, but give me the opportunity to learn and understand an industry that has been deemed quote unquote unstable. And then kind of just giving certain anecdotes. So this sentence where it talks about the non-art institutions have always implemented the starting artist narrative is kind of more of an implement to Ars Nova's commitment to accessibility for artists, and providing resources for artists and making sure that artists are paid fairly. And then even directly quoting it in the next sentence where I'm talking about Ars Nova's commitment to education, diversity, inclusion, which is stated in their about page. Saying that like, which I think the other thing to add too is that like you can also, it doesn't have to be in the way where you're catering to them in the sense of you were saying things that like you think will make them pick you, but in a sense of you are being clear about what exactly you want. And I think the other reason why that's important is because when you go into a space, especially for fellowships where you're there for a long period of time, being clear on what you would want out of it. For me, I think like being like a Southeast Asian person, like navigating time and time again, being in a space, knowing that I'm only there as a diversity quota, that's something that I didn't want to go into when I went to Ars Nova. So I straight up just said I didn't want to be just another person of color who was one of the few in an arts administration, but actually engage in conversations and initiatives that support the IPOC. So see the opportunity when they say like, what do you want out of this organization? What are you hoping to get? Be clear on what you exactly want, and don't be afraid to be honest of what you want within those programs. Okay, the proposal. What are you working on and why? This is specifically for grants and residencies where you need to work on a project. So the first thing is including what type of work it will be and what mediums you will use. Mention every aspect of the work. I emphasize this because I think oftentimes, and I've made this mistake too, artists tend to get caught up in the themes and other aspects and the very important things that surround a project in the sense of understanding what you were tackling, what are you addressing, what dialogues will take place within your work, that the small things like what exactly is it kind of slip through the cracks. I've definitely gone extensively about the title of a work and just said, oh, this talks about grief and death and navigating loss, but not saying that it's a theater piece. So just make sure that you include what type of work it is and what mediums you will use. If you are doing hybrid work, just say that. If it's an iteration of another work, also say that as well. Yeah, so just make sure that that is said right off the bat in the very beginning, just so you don't have to worry about it too much towards the end. Explain what the project is in an intentional yet concise way. This should be about like 1 to 3 sentences. Just generally what it's about. And then you can go into the significance of the project and what aspects are highlighted in this project. So what are the themes, what are the dialogues that are being held in this? 4 is kind of an extension of it, but what is the overall takeaway of the piece? What is the message that you're trying to convey in it? Yes, you discussed the themes prior, but what are you actually trying to say? That should be about 1 to 2 sentences. If the why, them, or statement of need is included in this section of the proposal, include that as well. And then close it off with a strong takeaway. In terms of all these things I mentioned before, it doesn't have to be in this exact order, but these things should be highlighted. So to give an example, I color-coded for this one. This is a proposal of a work that I did, which was a choreopoem interpretation of my poetry book that I did with Prelude Festival. So the blue is basically the parts that kind of discuss the themes and the messages that are being conveyed. The red is specifically the description, what it is, what exactly it is. All the stuff that's in green, so Dion is overwhelmed by the loss of her people. She knows that one day, that's what the project is about. That's just a general description. Notice that it's not in the same exact order. And then the purple is kind of just explaining what inspired the piece, the themes that surround it, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I kind of color coded it to kind of emphasize that it doesn't have to be in a specific order of how you say things, but they should also be included or incorporated in some way. All right, so for the bio, these are kind of the smaller things that we're going to tackle for a little bit. But this is just a general overview of your work, your identities and accolades, usually in a 150 word or less summary. The first sentence, this one I'm going to suggest having an order for it, but of course, kind of after the first sentence, everything else kind of goes. But the way that I like to do the bio, just because keep in mind whenever you're doing these applications, oftentimes how they skim through people is usually similar to a resume, like a quick, like 1 minute or less. So it's nice to highlight everything that's like really big and flashy in the beginning. So the first sentence should include what you do. So any identifying information that's important to your work. So race, gender, sexuality, et cetera, and other important factors. 2 is putting your most recent biggest project. It could be like a theater project. It could be an ongoing series. It could be a collective that you co-own. Just something that's recent, but also like is relatively big. The third thing is kind of list the second biggest things that are happening that have already received awards or features. So if you're not currently working on it, has there been things associated with it? Has there been like flashy awards? Has there been features? Has it been published anywhere? Has it had an exhibit? Yeah, something along those lines. Number 4 is list your accolades from recent to oldest. So whatever happened from 2021, and then you go 2020, 2019, 2018, etc. And then mention any of the venues your work has been featured in. If they don't necessarily fit in the earlier categories, put them in the work that you're featured in. So like, for instance, for me, for poetry, I think mostly my stuff is in poetry, but I've also done a lot of performance. So usually my last sentence is kind of where I perform my poetry. So it's like, they performed at the Apollo, Brooklyn Museum, et cetera, et cetera. Some quick tips, just from being in applications for a while. Have different versions of your bio, specifically a 50-word one, a 150 to 200-word one, and a 2 to 4 sentence bio. So it should be those 3 things. The reason why I say this is because those are the common versions of your bio to be asked. So have a 150 to 200 word one, which is like your biggest one. Then make sure you have a version of that where it's condensed to 50 words, and then have a version where it's like 2 sentences, 2 to 4 sentences or less. Also, feel free to add personal anecdotes if you want to. The things I mentioned are just kind of the standard things that are required in a bio, but feel free to add things like, what's your favorite color? Where did you live, and like, where do you care about? What colors do you enjoy? What books do you like? What are your current obsessions? Don't be afraid to add those things too. Okay, so this bio of mine is long and pretentious. But to kind of just quickly scroll through it. So as I said before, the first sentence is just who I am and what I do. So queer non-binary, Indonesian Muslim, writer, multimedia artist, born and raised in Queens, New York. I put the Queens in New York part because that's very important to me. What I'm recently doing right now, or the recent big thing, quote unquote, is like doing a book tour. So I'm going to put the fact that I'm promoting my book and say that I'm the author of Cut Woman and most recently I Need This Not Swallow Me Alive. And then things that I've had previously, but like are also kind of big deals. I got commissioned for plays, right? So I would mention my little play commissions. And then I start mentioning the previous projects. So like how like Cut Woman as a choreopoem was featured at Prelude Festival in 2020. And then I start listing all the accolades where it's like Governor's Island resident, Broadway for Racial Justice fellow, 2020 Seventh Wave Editorial, etc., etc. And then the things that kind of don't fit but are still important to me, like being a Converse All Stars Artist and a United Nations Together Band Global Ambassador. I kind of put them in a separate sentence just because they kind of fall in a similar category of artist-based like collaboration slash sponsorships, and then include publications and then performances. That's just where I've been featured, and that's pretty much it. Yeah, and then I'm gonna try to get through this very quickly towards the end. So in terms of quick tips, make sure you cater your application to where you're applying, but don't be afraid to reuse certain elements. So as a foundation. So your bio and artist statement can be reused as much as you want. The why them, if orgs have similar or same values, you could reuse them to a certain degree. Two, save all of your applications in different documents. What might work for one application can also work for another, so just keep that in mind. When writing, imagine you're being asked these questions in an interview and then transcribe your responses. That's usually how I like to form my responses personally, so that usually helps. Don't be afraid to be honest and critical of your industries. Don't feel like you have to cater to a certain voice or an organization. And the final thing really for tips is copying and pasting the questions on a separate document and answering from there. You don't have to write directly on the app first, and I also do not fully recommend that. For organizing submissions, save every opportunity. Usually the way I go about it is saving every opportunity on social media or research, and usually keeping them through screenshots, notes, or the save feature on Instagram. And then after a week or so, or after a certain number of saves, just adding them to a log of some kind, whether that's an Excel sheet or a calendar. Personally, I like to use my written planner. Remember the key dates. So the first, 15th, and the last day of every month usually have the most deadlines, or the deadlines are circulating that time. So check your calendar 2 to 3 days before each of these things so you make sure you don't miss anything. And yeah, keep a log of everything due if needed. And then just going quickly through these. Common questions and misconceptions. Just because you apply, that doesn't mean you'll get a formal response. If they don't apply for a long period of time, usually it's just a rejection. Not every rejection is bad. Sometimes the next year offers more better resources and we'll consider you next year. So keep applying to the same opportunities. And one question I get a lot is, what if I don't have a work sample? And usually what people mean is, what if I don't have anything published? A work sample doesn't mean it has to be published or produced. It can just be a PDF file of works in progress or an unedited clip of your work that can be password protected. While it doesn't have to be produced, you still need work samples. If you work in multiple mediums, how do you provide a portfolio? Have one page with all of your work, but categorize it by the different mediums. This is another question I get a lot, is how do I get brand sponsorships for my art? For me personally, it's usually merit-based. And usually the company will reach out to you. This was the case for me with the United Nations. But there are some artist development programs that aren't entirely advertised. So the Converse All Stars program is one. I know Vans has an artist program as well. They don't outwardly advertise it, but it's there for people who look. And they do that on purpose because they want to make sure people are dedicated to their brand. But I will say that they do care about if you've had experiences working with other brands. So for me, getting Spotify and Converse, like, I know they were heavily influenced by the fact that I used to collaborate with Fluid Project and Teen Vogue. Do I need to care about social media presence or follower count? No, No, you don't. You don't need to censor yourself in order to receive things. In general, you shouldn't be racist, homophobic, sexist, transphobic overall. But you shouldn't worry about your social media impacting your accolades. Like I've seen people who are just straight up meme pages and they've gotten like really phenomenal residencies. So don't worry about it. And yeah, I think that is it. Yeah, that is pretty much the presentation. I'm sorry it like hit exactly at 8 o'clock, but yeah.
No, that was wonderful. That was so informational. I feel like it was so helpful to have everything laid out like that. I hope folks who are watching live have some questions for us. We'd be certainly really happy to answer a few of those. And then folks who are watching this later, hopefully they can get in contact with you as well. I'm going to share the contact information for In Full Color in the chat. And if you're watching this, you can reach out to us at infullcolor.org, or you can email me, summer@infullcolor.org. If you have any questions, we'd love to help you make it happen, because there are artists out there who need to get these opportunities. Let me see if there's anything in the chat. Or do you have any comments, Dena, or anything that you wanted to address?
Yeah, I'll say, it's a little bit touching on the social media aspect, but like focusing again on how like I think there is a common notion that artists have to be publicly perceived and have to have a public image in order to get these things. And you genuinely don't. I have seen so many amazing artists where like they don't even have social media and they get like all these amazing things. So I say this in regards to the fact that like if you feel like you're not comfortable with having a public presence, or for whatever reason you don't have a public presence, whether that's social media, whether that's like having work out there, whether that's like doing like in-person gigs, you don't have to worry about that too much, and that's not going to impede you from like getting the art support and resources that you need.
I love that. That's very, very encouraging. Oh, we have a question from Kelly Ho. Hey, Dena, do you have any tips for those who aren't super strong with writing in general? I find that I get caught up in editing mostly.
Okay, so what I did, especially in the beginning, because I think like I wasn't super strong with writing overall, and how I've also helped folks is usually you can either one, have a friend kind of just chat with you about like these questions. It doesn't have to be this like formal interview, and then having that transcribed or having yourself recorded. Or if you want to do that with yourself, where it's like you're asking the question, okay, well, who am I as an artist and why do I care? And kind of talking out loud. One app that I really like, and I'll type it in the chat, but Otterbox is great for transcriptions. I've used it a lot, and what I will do is just kind of talk straight into it. It'll transcribe everything. I'll copy and paste it in a separate document and then edit from there, because I'm also the type of person where I get caught up in editing mostly first. So usually transcribing in that way and then going to it is usually one way. If you're not comfortable with using your voice, I like using the 7-minute rule, where it's dedicating 7 minutes of just writing whatever, not stopping, not lifting your paper from pencil, keyboard, etc., and timing yourself where you do not edit anything. You are just writing whatever, even if for a while it's just nothing, 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 nothing over and over until something comes out. When the 7 minutes comes in, then you go back and edit. I think timing yourself usually helps in those things. And I think also, if these also don't work, I also highly recommend like looking at other artist statements. If you want a good website, I will say Winter Tangerine. I'm going to type it in chat. But whenever they do publications, there's always an artist statement that is associated with it. And I think looking at those kind of first will kind of usually help me. It's not copying, but it's just like figuring out like, well, what do I already want to include and highlight? So it's kind of this internal editing prior to writing it and then writing right into it. So yeah, I hope that helps. Yeah, of course. No problem, Kelly.
Very cool. So I want to be respectful of everyone's time. And if anyone has any more questions, you can always feel free to reach out to me and I'll pass them on to Dena. Everyone will be getting a copy of today's presentation as well as a recording. Thank you so much, Dena, for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge with us. This was so amazing. And I see why you get all of these amazing opportunities. You clearly deserve them. And you also have just like everything's so well laid out. I was blown away by looking at the examples that you were sharing today.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you again, Dena, for this amazing presentation. And I hope everyone has a wonderful evening.
Yeah, everyone have a wonderful evening. And thank you, Summer. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.